Te dije que iba a venir Hi. I thought you were going to get here.
Donald and I decided that we were looking at the intermediate class in January. Oh, Donald, he says no.
I may be in there in the year 2025.
That's very interesting.
Do you want a picture?
May I have your attention? We're going to go ahead and get started, please. Could we all please stand before the Padre Nuestro? Padre Nuestro, here it comes forward. It's on the board, excuse me, it's on the screen. If you'd like to move closer, you can. If you have your copy, but if you need to move close here, some of the Padre de Hijo, Espíritu Santo. Padre nuestro que estás en el cielo, santificado sea tu nombre. Venga a nosotros tu reino. Hágase tu voluntad, así en la tierra como en el cielo. Danos hoy nuestro pan de cada día. Perdona nuestras ofensas, como también nosotros perdonamos a nuestros ofensores. Y no nos dejes caer en la tentación, mas líbranos del mal. Amén. Notice this, mas, as it is noticed in the Padre Nuestro, mas, but, líbranos del mal. This mas, for most people in modern Spanish, mas means more, and it has an accent mark, doesn't it? This is the old mas. Mas meaning but without an accent mark. Mas líbranos, y no nos dejes caer en la tentación. Mas líbranos del mas, but rather, it's almost like saying, but rather, mas. So I just wanted to make sure you knew that use of mas before we got started. You know, we've had already a really, here I am. I'm talking as if, you know, this has all been a great success. Well, from my perspective, it has been. We started off with the beginning of the language, and we talked about the Romance languages. We talked about Rome. We talked about the Roman contributions to the Iberian Peninsula, which are not just to the Iberian Peninsula, right? Remember those three, the big three, which were again law, religion, and language. Okay. Then last time we talked some about the Romans in Spain, the Hispano-Romans, how the Hispano-Romans eventually ended up adopting a form of Christianity which we now know is Roman Catholicism, right? It's Trinitarian. It's Trinitarian Christianity. It's Trinitarian Espíritu Santo. Padre, Hijo, Espíritu Santo, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit. That is very important because, as I said, remember the Visigoths. When the Visigoths come, they're Christians culturally, but the form of Christianity they've adopted is Arianism, following the leader Arius, and they reject the notion of the divinity of the second person of the Trinity, that is Christ. So they are Arians, and they immediately begin squabbling with the Hispano-Romans who are Trinitarians. And look, I like to sprinkle my presentations with oversimplifications, but sometimes these big statements aren't entirely wrong, which is to actually quote one of my teachers, Professor Norman Sachs from Wisconsin, many, many years ago. He said to our class, never underestimate the power of religion. Never underestimate the power of religion. Never underestimate the power of religion. Doesn't matter what so many of the people I work with think that religion is just a history of superstition and so on. No. Never underestimate the power of religion. We'll see this over and over and over again in this history. Those groups fight, the Visigoths, the Arian Visigoths fight, the Hispano-Romans, they struggle. And finally, does anyone remember what the first step was to their reconciliation? What was sort of like the first big step that brought them finally to some kind of an agreement? Marriage. Who said marriage? Excellent. And this is what happens, right? Someone from the family marries someone from outside the community, and sure enough, with time, the Hispano, I'm calling them Hispano now, Hispano-Visigoths. Visigoths, as I said, means West Goths. They're from the western part. Ostrogoth means eastern parts. The Hispano-Visigoths say, look, we're surrounded by these Hispano-Romans. They outnumber us, huge. They have a huge numerical advantage. Maybe we should adopt their religion so that we can rule them more successfully. And they ended up, again, an oversimplification, but they do accept Hispano-Roman Trinitarianism. So it turned out that the Arian Visigoths become themselves Trinitarians, and so really for a short time, not that long, 200 years max, the Visigothic Iberian Peninsula, all this area, is Trinitarian and Christian. Almost everywhere. Almost everywhere. You think, well, that can't be. Well, it actually is probably the vast majority of the people for a while. And then 7-Eleven, I talked about it last time. What happens in 7-Eleven? The huge wave from the south. Islam. Islam was on fire then. By that I mean it spread very quickly, very, very, very quickly. By 718, it's up here. It's gone all the way up. And then I said, if you'll remember last time I talked about Santiago de Compostela, and the Reconquista, the reconquest. If the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula took 8 years, right? The reconquest took almost 800, right? An amazing story. It's an amazing story. So that after a matter of 3 centuries, you really have 2 Spains. This, again, I'm simplifying, but I think if you think of it this way, it gives you like the bigger picture. You really have 2 Spains. You have a south, the southern part of Spain, which is under Islamic rule. And what's the name for that place? Al-Andalus. In Andalusia in modern times, right? Andalusia in the south was Al-Andalus. And there's the old theory about the meaning of Al-Andalus. Does anyone remember what Al-Andalus presumably means? It means the place of the Vandals. Here's how it probably would have been pronounced. Os Vándalos. Os Vándalos, the Vandals, right? Os Vándalos. Al-Andalus, Os Vándalos, the place of the Vandals. So their the southern part of Spain, which includes important cities like Granada, Granada and Cordoba, remain under Islamic rule for centuries. Granada is in fact the last place that was taken over by Christians during the Reconquest, 1492, at the late 1480s, 1492. But before that time, it's very important to remember something. I think people sometimes don't recognize the fact that it's that time, the time of Al-Andalus, the time of the Islamic rule in the south, has a tremendous impact, which lasts even to today. I think I said the other day there are at least 4,000 words in common usage in the Spanish language that come directly from Arabic. At least 4,000, and probably closer to 5,000, but at least 4,000 words as common as, think of almost any word that begins with al. Al. The al means the. It's the definite article in Arabic, right? Al. So the this, the that. For example, the word for cotton. What is that word in Spanish? Algodón. Algodón. Cotton. That's an Arabic word. Algodón. Other words that begin with al. I'm going to ask my technical. I'm looking. Think of some words that come from. Here's another word. Okay, I said cotton, didn't I? Algodón. What is the word for pillow? Almohada. 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 In fact, one of the groups that rules Al-Andalus for a while are sometimes called the people of the pillow. Yes. Almohades. Almohades, right? There are many groups. Many groups. Let's go to the al. Here's one. Alcachofa, artichoke. But there are, let's see if we can move to the al section. There are many. Here's an example of an Arabic word near us right now. Near us right now. There's a street, and you find this
Alameda.
Alameda in Portuguese. Alameda in Castilian. Probably means, I've asked 3 of our Arabic teachers the meaning of this. One meaning is the place of the columns. The place of, so it's like a main drag. Alameda, right? The name of the city that had the great university for biblical studies in the early 16th century. The name of the city was Alcalá de Henares. Alcalá de Henares is the Arabic name for a city that was known in Latin as Complutum. And that is why the University of Madrid is called La Universidad Complutense. Complutense, named remembering Alcalá de Henares when Alcalá de Henares was when that university was really at its greatest moment in the days of Cardinal Cisneros in the early 16th century, up to the 30s and 40s and 50s of the 16th century. A Bible was produced there. You say Bible was produced. Man, what are you smoking? No, a new kind of Bible, really. It's called a polyglot Bible. In Spanish, it's called una Biblia políglota. Polyglota. What would the meaning of polyglota mean? Many languages. It's the polyglot Bible produced at Alcalá de Henares in its day in the Christian world was the most impressive scholarly Bible available. Why? Because it included the texts in their biblical languages, in their original languages. So what languages would we have to include if we were preparing a polyglot Bible? Now, don't forget, this isn't now, this is back then. A polyglot Bible back in the, I'm sure that there's probably an image of the Biblia Poliglota Complutense. It's called Biblia Poliglota Complutense. Again, Complutense, Complutum, Alcalá de Henares. It's prepared at Alcalá de Henares, and it's, I believe it appeared in 1527. But I saw a copy of it recently. There's a Biblia Poliglota Complutense. Where do you think I saw a copy, an original? Biblia Poliglota Complutense. I held
In
it
the
in
museum
my
of the Bible?
the Museum of
In
the
Washington.
Bible in Oklahoma City. Yes. One of my colleagues in another department is giving talks all over the country against this museum, saying, "Oh, this is horrible. This is an aberration." We'll talk about that at another time. But the Biblia Poliglota Complutense. So what languages are we probably, I want you to know that there was a lot of learning going on in Spain at this time. So what languages would we have to include if we were going to prepare a polyglot Bible and thinking in terms of the biblical languages that were probably studied and known in the early 16th century?
Hebrew and Greek.
Well, you gotta have Hebrew. Why do you have to have Hebrew? Why do you have to have Hebrew? Because if you don't have Hebrew, you don't have anything. You don't, and when it comes to Bible, if you don't have Hebrew, you don't have anything. That's the foundation, Hebrew. But not just Hebrew. There are actually other languages which you have to include. Greek was mentioned, Koine Greek, New Testament Greek. This is, well, please, if we could go back to that just for a second. That was so beautiful. This is what a polyglot Bible looks like. It's in columns.
Oh my God.
It's in columns. You'll have a text, and the columns, typically here are the columns you'll see. First of all, you'll have probably something from one of the original Hebrew manuscripts. How did these Spaniards get a hold of Hebrew manuscripts? Wow, that story I'm about to tell. There's a long history of Hebrew manuscripts in Spain, because there's a long history of the Jews in Spain. We'll talk about it a little bit. But you're going to have a column. If it's an Old Testament text, you're going to have the Hebrew. What else do you think you're probably going to have? Sometimes those texts appear in Aramaic. What is Aramaic?
The spoken language.
It's a language which is not the formal language of ritual. It's not the formal language usually, but it's certainly the spoken language. What is now the state of Israel, in an earlier time, the land of Israel, in Palestine, many names for the Holy Land, right? There are many names for Zion. There are many names. So you're going to have Hebrew. Also, sometimes some of the texts appear in Aramaic because sometimes the oldest version we can find is in Aramaic.
The wedding ceremony is in Aramaic.
Aramaic is a very important biblical language, right? It's many texts are in Aramaic. So you have to have Aramaic. What would you say if I said also many of them are in Chaldean? What's Chaldean? Again, another language related, right, to Hebrew, to Aramaic, that Semitic family. Another language you sometimes find in a polyglot Bible, if it's a big one, and there was one in the early 17th century called the Walton Polyglot, which OU has an original copy of. What, another language you find often in polyglot Bibles of later ages, not here at this moment with the Políglota Complutense from the 1520s, is Arabic. Probably said, Arabic? How is that possible? Here is how it's possible. In Arabic are preserved many texts that are lost in the other languages. I don't know how many people know that. Arabic is a treasure house for preservation of old biblical texts. Many preserved in Arabic. So you're going to have those languages for the New Testament. You've got to have the Greek text. You had to have the Greek text. One of the greatest biblical scholars lived at the same time as the Polyglot Bible was being prepared in the 1520s. You know his name. His name was Erasmus. Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus was invited to be a part of the team by the leader of the team, Cardinal Cisneros. He wrote, I've probably told the story, so some of you are laughing. You know, this man is getting senile. He's told us the story 10 times. Erasmus is invited by Cardinal Cisneros, and Cardinal Cisneros writes to Erasmus and says, we want you to be a part of our team at our new university, founded by Cardinal Cisneros himself. And Erasmus writes back, non place Hispania. I don't like Spain. So where do you think he went? He was originally from Rotterdam. Where do you think he went after he rejected the Spanish invitation? If you want to know a country that in some ways and sensibility is the opposite of Spain in Western Europe, what place would you think of? What was it? Absolutely, it was England. It was England. Oh, where he, of course, where he flourished. He was friends with important people there. He himself prepared a Latin translation of the New Testament, which was probably the greatest translation, I would say. Latin, or probably for some Catholics here, it wasn't Latin the language of the Bible. Latin was the language of biblical texts used officially by the church. Still used. The Latin translation is called the Vulgata, the common language. Latin, because Latin was the language of scholarship, it was the language of ritual, it was the language of the church, it was the language of church music, Gregorian chant. It was the language of learning, of culture, but it was not originally a biblical language. No. Biblical texts were not originally in Latin. They were in other languages. They were in those other languages I mentioned, right? But all translated into Latin, and Latin, of course, becomes the language of the Roman Church. It was early on, it continued because of that association with Rome. You can be sure that in Spain, to my knowledge, and if I'm wrong, Dr. Luis will tell you right now, no one had probably ever heard Mass in Castilian until the 1960s. No one had heard Mass in Castilian until the 1960s. No one had heard a Mass in Catalan until the 1960s. Absolutely not. It was in Latin. It was in Latin. And the prayers were in Latin, the responses.
It was everywhere, though, right?
It was the language of the Roman Church until Vatican II. The Second Vatican Council allows the use of the vernacular, so that really in many, well, I guess almost everywhere, no one had heard a Roman Catholic Mass said in a language other than Latin for the longest time. Now, as we know, there are other denominations within the Catholic world that aren't Roman Catholic, right? There are
Greek Catholics.
many other denominations, but I mean, even in communion with Rome, here's an example.
I'd be careful, I wanna use the word denomination.
You are absolutely right.
Yeah.
There are
Many different,
other communities
right.
of Catholics
The
in
Uniates,
communion
there's
with
28
Rome,
rites.
officially under the headship of the Roman Pontiff, that are not Roman Catholic. An example,
The Coptics, the Maronites,
the
the
Maronites,
Chaldeans,
and the Maronites
the Greek.
here, in Norman, Oklahoma.
Right,
There's a Maronite church. Some of you may know Our Lady of Lebanon. I want to ask you, in the Maronite service, the official
no,
church
they are,
of
it's just like the
Lebanese
Roman-
Catholics, right?
Right,
All right. In what language are the prayers we know as the consecration? In what language do we find those prayers? Who knows the name of that language? Yes? It's actually Aramaic. It's Syriac. The language is called Syriac, which is Christian Aramaic. Christian Aramaic is Syriac, right? And were these languages studied in Spain? Yes. Were they spoken? The languages spoken in Spain, let's say the year 1000, you can be sure Arabic in the south was the lingua franca, was spoken all over. Oh, that's beautiful.
that's your.
I can't believe it. I feel like if I touch it, I'll remember a hymn in Aramaic. I won't remember it right now. So if we go back to the year 1000, we know that in the south, the lingua franca is Arabic, and it is spoken, are you ready? Not just by the Islamic peoples. Since it's the lingua franca, it's also spoken by many Christians. And in fact, the majority of probably the vast majority of Christians living in southern Spain under Islamic rule, if they adopt Arabic and begin, even though they still embrace their Christian religion, they take on certain Islamic customs, for example, dress, they become known as Mozárabes. Mozárabes, which means in Spanish, Arabizado, Arabized. Arabizado, Mozárabes. Some people believe, not all, some people believe, some linguists believe, that the earliest version of Castilian becomes modern Spanish was actually a form of Castilian spoken by the people, the Christians who lived in Al-Andalus, Andalusia in the south. The Christians who lived under Islamic rule, the Christians living under Islamic rule spoke, we know this, and I'm going to tell you how we know it. They spoke an early form of Castilian. An early form. This was theorized for the longest time. And then, in 1948, it's always nice when you can point to a date, isn't it? And a very important discovery was made. See if any of you know what I'm referring to. This is in the history of the Spanish language. What important discovery was made in 1948 concerning the Mozárabes? A series of manuscripts were found of all places in Cairo. In Cairo, called in Spanish El Cairo. El Cairo. A whole series of manuscripts were found with Arabic poetry in a Geniza. The Geniza of Cairo. What is a Geniza? There it is. What is a Geniza? It is a place where Jews traditionally keep, house, and often bury books so that they will not be destroyed. After they've been used, it's a storage facility usually, and it's almost like a cemetery for books, right? The Geniza of Cairo has thousands and thousands and thousands of books and manuscripts written by hand. And there, in 48, a famous philologist, historian of languages, Gustav Stern, discovered the Hadjas. The Hadjas, we just had a Hadjas are poems. They're couplets. These are thought to go back as far back as the year 1040, right? There is Samuel, I thought his name was Gustav, that was maybe his brother. Samuel Stern, 1948. He discovers at the end of these big texts written in Arabic, in the Arabic alphabet, texts that seem indecipherable, but they were couplets that were actually written in a primitive form of Spanish, which he would call, many call Mozarabe. Mozarabe. That's, if you want to know, well, where are the oldest documents we have? Probably they're the Hadjas, they're these couplets, and then he found other manuscripts, many of them in Hebrew. And at the end in Hebrew script. Now, one thing about Hebrew script you have to remember, traditionally, Hebrew is written without vowels.
Absolutely.
So you have to be able to reconstruct, right? So without the vowels, now how are you going to do this? But Stern, after he had seen the text in Arabic, he said, oh yeah, we can probably make out this text at the end of the poem, even though they're in Hebrew script. And there they were. The first evidence we have, the first recorded evidence we have of what we would now call the Spanish language, Castilian, is actually found at the end of poems written in Arabic, written in Hebrew. They're couplets written in another alphabet, not in the Roman alphabet. And these are called Hadjas, these couplets at the end. And the texts are called textos aljamiados, which means Spanish written in either Hebrew or Arabic. How long would this tradition go on of writing, it's a trick question, of writing Spanish in Hebrew letters? How long would this tradition survive?
1492. Or during the expulsion of the Jews.
So we know that the Jews are expelled from Spain in 1492. Is that the end of Spanish being written in Hebrew script?
Possibly.
How long does it go on? What would you say if I told you this story? Almost until today. What happened?
Ladino.
The Jews are expelled. Their language goes with them. They're spoken. Not their language of the religion, not the language of ritual. The language spoken at home goes with them. Where does it go? Wherever Jews go. First to Portugal, then, I'm sure if you just write Sephardic diaspora, Sephardic.
So when they get kicked out?
Pardon?
When they get kicked out?
1492.
What is it, why?
Pardon, why?
Yeah.
Because the Catholic kings wanted everybody to be Christian. Absolutely everybody.
Oh,
So
okay.
they didn't just kick the Jews out. It was non-Christian groups. Don't forget, they had just, this was the end of the Reconquest. They said, no more Arabic. No more Arabic and no more Jews. They wanted them all
Oh,
out.
okay.
Pardon?
Is it okay?
It wasn't okay.
Hell no, it wasn't okay.
That's an okay answer. I
You're
understand.
asking me, was it okay? Hell no, it wasn't
No, I said
okay.
I understand why you said
I'm
they
telling
get
you
kicked
what
out.
happened. So, if we think about this diaspora, the expulsion of the Jews, so where do the Jews go? Meaning the biggest number goes to Portugal, and when after the king is taken, all their money, all their possessions, all they own He says, you're now expelled from Portugal, 1497. So the Jews go throughout the Mediterranean world, Sardinia, they go to France, but France has already kicked out the Jews. They go to England, England has already kicked the Jews out. They go to the Netherlands. Does anyone know what city was an especially important place for the Jews who were expelled from Spain? What place in the Netherlands?
I'll guess Amsterdam.
Amsterdam is the correct answer.
There's a beautiful synagogue there.
The Snoga. The Snoga. Next door to the house of a Sephardic Jew, Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher, political theorist. What does the word Sephardic, you're hearing me use this word. Sephardic comes from Hebrew, I'm told, Sefarad. Sefarad, which means Spain. The Spanish Jews are the Sephardic Jews. So what happens? They continue after they've been expelled from Spain. They say, now we can build a temple, we can build a synagogue, we can worship here. Amsterdam was a much freer city than the three synagogues right next to each other, and one of them, of course, is the Portuguese synagogue. The Portuguese synagogue may be called the Portuguese synagogue, but you can be sure that the language spoken there was Spanish, because the Portuguese Jews spoke Spanish. Their ancestors had come from Spain. Spain is much more important, I mean, this is my opinion, in the history of the Jews
Yes.
than Portugal. Spain is very, very, very important in the history of the Jews. So they go to Portugal. Some would go to some of the Dutch colonies. And some of them went to a place called Recife in Brazil, under Dutch rule, Recife, with an R, like Recife. From Recife, pardon? Also, yes. From Recife, though, we know specifically from Recife, a small group, when the Portuguese retook control of that part of Brazil, when the Portuguese came back, they took with them the Inquisition. And those Jews said, now we've got to go. And they went to a place, this is a true story, that small group, 12 families in the beginning, leave Recife, they go to a place which is called New Amsterdam.
Oh,
What city is that?
New York City.
New York City. It's first, before it's New York, is New Amsterdam, right? That's why the name of that river, the Harlem River, that's a Dutch river, right? That's a Dutch river. New Amsterdam, the first Jews we know of in New York actually had come from Recife, and they were Sephardic Jews. An important Supreme Court justice, whose last name was Cardozo, was actually a Sephardic Jew. So that is very important in the history of Spanish. Why? Because the Sephardic Jews spoke Spanish. In Amsterdam, they had presses that published works in Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. They actually had also another press where they could publish works in Hebrew. And some communities published all their Ladino material in Hebrew script. All their Ladino, in other words, it's like this. Yiddish is Judeo-German, but usually Yiddish is written in Hebrew script. But it's it's part of the Germanic family. It's Judeo-German. In the same way, Ladino, which has many names, is Judeo-Spanish. Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. That language survives. In the 19th century, there were many newspapers, especially in a place called Salonika, Thessaloniki in Greece. Huge community of Ladino speakers. I have been there I studied their newspapers. I have newspapers from Thessaloniki, from Salonika. They then often later would publish their newspapers in Latin script. So we have surviving Latin script Ladino. That entire community was wiped out by the Nazis in World War II. The entire community, almost all, of 58,000 people who were Ladino speakers at Thessaloniki, 1943. By 1945, 55,000 were gone, died in Auschwitz. Ladino, in some ways, died in the camps in World War II. The Ladino language, which was spoken in many places, there are still people speaking in Sarajevo. There are neighborhoods where Ladino is spoken, called Españolite in Jerusalem today. There are people in Argentina who preserve small communities. Atlanta, of course, New York. Atlanta, New York, Seattle. There are communities of Ladino speakers. There's a small community of Ladino speakers in Mexico City. The name that Mexicans use to describe the Sephardic Jews is this name, Turcos. Why do you think they call them Turks? Turcos, the name for Sephardic Jew, Turco, because it was after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, World War I, that the Ladino communities went to Mexico and established themselves in a place in Mexico City called La Lagunilla. La Lagunilla. It's the garment district. In fact, there's still a synagogue there at La Lagunilla. Yeah, okay, our time is up. We're going to continue next time talking about maybe the end of Al-Andalus, because after the Spanish Catholic kings expelled, right, the Islamic peoples expelled the Jews, that whole region becomes Christian only, right? So Andalusia also has to adapt, change, transform. And that is really the beginning of Spain as a nation, right? When Castile, Aragon, Navarra, Galicia, and the south, Andalusia, all come together to form what we now call España. Muchas gracias. Does everybody know who their teacher is? Are we okay with teachers today? Do you have any questions? I think you should ask Jennifer. Thank you.
Commenting me after 25. He was your teacher 30 years ago. Wow.
I know what you mean. That you understood it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's